This story begins with the creation of what many people believe to be the first JRPG ever made, Dragon Quest, in 1985. Hiroshi Miyaoka, a friend of Dragon Quest creator Yuji Horii, worked as a scenario assistant on the first 3 games of the Famicom trilogy. One of the most notorious examples of his work is the Cave to Roan in Dragon Quest II. If you've ever been Roan-boned, then you can blame Hiroshi Miyaoka for it. After the production of these 3 games, Miyaoka started his own game development company called Createch in 1988 and developed Metal Max, which released near the end of the Famicom era in Japan in 1991, just a few months after the Super Famicom release. Metal Max was marketed with the slogan, "We've had enough dragon slaying," taking a jab at the growing popularity of the Dragon Quest series at the time. If Dragon Quest was the first JRPG, Metal Max could arguably be considered one of the first well-developed open-world JRPGs, although technically you could explore the entire world at the start of the original Dragon Quest too. Metal Max was lighter on having a main quest narrative, instead opting to let players explore and discover the history of a ruined world on a much more open field where interesting story elements could be altogether skipped and players could accidentally wander to the end of the game. As a hunter, players are loosely guided along by mostly optional bounties hidden on the world map and in the game's dungeons, many of which were also optional. With the promise of new tanks, stronger weapons, pieces of lore that good open-world games are known for, and juicy bounties were reasons enough to get players excited to explore these places. I'm not going to spoil the story to Metal Max, but I do want to say it is a lot more thought-provoking here in 2023, where artificial intelligence is rapidly advancing to a point where it's trusted to make important decisions for people. I bet you didn't expect a little bit of philosophy in the discussion of a story to a video game series that began in 1991, but Metal Max is just that awesome. I think the final boss of Metal Max is one of the coolest final bosses ever, who just leaves a really powerful impact for future games in the series. While many bounties are mutants and machines, some of the bounties are real interesting characters. In addition to the bounties, side stories like Wolf's in particular are very dramatic for a game made in 1991. His legacy continues with his vehicle making welcome appearances in future games. You might say the setting of the world seems inspired by the setting of the Mad Max series of films, but while the consequences of society's breakdown and the deterioration of the environment leave a similar sense of lawlessness, the game goes in a completely different direction, with its story leaning more heavily towards science fiction, which also is the foundation for the setting of the future games in the series. You can almost imagine a Mad Max film being a side quest or chapter in one of these games. While the open world gameplay was a primary selling point, the most obvious and striking difference between Metal Max and other prominent RPGs at the time like Final Fantasy and Megami Tensei were the vehicular combat aspects of the game and its tank customization and gameplay. Like many ambitious games that arrive at the end of a console generation, the gameplay and imagination behind the original Metal Max was incredibly innovative for its time. The original game lent itself extremely well to its Super Famicom remake, Metal Max Returns, which has an amazing fan translation and was personally my first adventure into the universe of Metal Max. Future games in the series build off of the events that created the world of Metal Max and what happens in the game. Sometimes it's vengeance that fuels the narratives, and sometimes it's a cliched journey to discover the memories you've lost. While Metal Max had your 3-person party set in stone with a hunter, mechanic, and a soldier, future games turned these into jobs for people you could hire to join you. In addition, more eccentric options like artist, fighter, wrestler, and nurse jobs were added with their own post-apocalyptic twists on job skills, appearances, and tank driving or foot fighting ability. You also get the option of including a powerful armed dog to your party that has become something of a mascot for the Metal Max games. All the games offer multiple endings that usually transpire from decisions to forget about the mysteries you haven't solved yet and marry or live with one of the characters you've met on your journey. Vehicles themselves range from your traditional tanks to cars, buses, bikes, and more eccentric options. Metal Max 2 Reloaded and Metal Max 3 have post-game bounties and content. You can also do New Game Plus loops that change things like the default locations of vehicles. In addition to the games themselves, short spin-off mangas were created around the worlds of Metal Max 2 and Metal Max 3. An adventure gamebook of the original Metal Max was created with an original final boss, which is something I have a hard time believing considering that the final boss of Metal Max is even more important and iconic to the entire series than even the final bosses of the first Dragon Quest and first Final Fantasy were to their series. All the Metal Max games share features that distinctly make them Metal Max. The Red Wolf tank is basically the Metal Max flagship vehicle featured in all the games I've played, and the bus is another popular recurring vehicle in the games. Your game doesn't end when your party loses all their hit points, and instead they're revived by a strange NPC called Dr. Minch in most games. His familiar and catchy background music is heard in all those games too. Tank and vehicle customization are always a thing, and it mostly gets deeper the later in the games you are. The theme that plays when you're hunting a bounty is distinct and doesn't change much between games. Most games also feature on-foot teleports, and also cool areas you can be unexpectedly teleported to through continually using using these teleports. Tank customization is always just dumb fun. There are definitely metas when it comes to tank design upgrades and mods, but sometimes for the sake of romance, you just want to strap a ton of one-shot wonder overpowered missiles to your silliest vehicles, and then just blow your load all over a bounty even if it's impractical for anything else. Weapons range from standard cannons to flamethrowers, frost blasters, electricity shooters, huge bombs, missiles, drills, and laser beams. Metal Max has its own elemental system, as you would expect from a good JRPG. While some bounties may be a challenge when you can first encounter them, the games aren't so difficult you have to use a meta, so you can just have fun and play how you want. Side quests are also more developed in future game entries, often as parts of side quest chains with branches that can end in different ways. Side quests can also unlock some nice features in the places you do them in. They're almost always optional, but more rewarding as a whole than side quests in a lot of other games that seem to exist for the sole purpose of wasting players' time. Starting from Metal Max 2, dogs become important elements of the Metal Max experience too, and they will usually take up a slot in your party at some point. Speaking for the games I have played, which are Metal Max Returns, Metal Max 2 Reloaded, Metal Max 3, Metal Saga, and Metal Max Xeno Reborn, I think the biggest thing that sets the numbered Metal Max series games back as games that can be enjoyed even today, compared to more modern AAA experiences, is the sheer amount of menuing required to interact with all the tank customization and personal equipment on your characters. Tanks have menus for everything: engines, weapons, computers, and shells. Then among weapons, you have your main cannons, auxiliary weapons, and special weapons. It was probably mind-blowing in its time for an NES game, and it's all done through menu systems that haven't changed much since the 90s. The games do offer a lot of shortcut options for the player to quickly access submenus that are normally inside other menus. Even being able to save loadouts would have been a nice time-saving feature for these games. If the games got more remakes, I think looking at how games like Xenoblade Chronicles Cross manage all the equipment that goes on a Skell would be a big hint as to how to improve the UI. Metal Max Xeno actually improved on a lot of the item management quite a bit, and that was one of the things I did like over the numbered flagship titles, even if I felt a lot of the tanks lost their originality. Unfortunately, Metal Max's late arrival to the Famicom is probably one of the few reasons the game was never localized and brought west by the publisher Data East at the time. The game's use of adult themes and mature language, while not explicit in imagery due to its heavy use of pixels, were also a barrier to a young Western games industry that hadn't even established a rating system yet for games largely marketed towards kids in the 90s. The Megami Tensei series suffered a similar fate, with the West not seeing a game in the series until 1995's Jack Brothers on Nintendo's mostly forgotten Virtual Boy of all consoles. Revelations Persona followed for the PlayStation in 1996. It wasn't until as late as 2004 that the West finally got to taste an actual flagship Shin Megami Tensei title with Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, featuring Dante from Devil May Cry. In any case, Metal Saga was Metal Max's maiden voyage to the West on PlayStation 2 as late as 2006, almost 15 years after Metal Max launched on the Famicom. Despite earning some fans, it wasn't received too well in the West relative to other JRPGs of the time. It wouldn't be until 2018 that we'd see Metal Max Xeno on the PlayStation 4, followed by a redone version of that game, Metal Max Xeno Reborn, in 2022, releasing on PlayStation 4, Switch, and PC. In fact, despite the West getting probably the worst first impression of the Metal Max series through games like Metal Saga and Metal Max Xeno, great games like Metal Max 2, 3, Metal Max 2 Reloaded, and Metal Max 4 Gekko no Diva, translated Diva the Moonlight or Moonlight Diva, remained exclusive to Japan with no plans for official localization in the West. Sadly, in Japan, the sales of each newer game have dwindled, and the latest game in the series, Metal Max Wild West, had to be cancelled. I seriously think if these games were properly localized and released to the larger Western market, they'd see a slight bump in popularity similar to what we've seen with the Romancing Saga series in the West. I do want to be clear, Metal Saga and Metal Max Xeno weren't terrible games, but I don't think they were the best first impression to give the West of Metal Max. Metal Saga lacked the adult grit of Metal Max. The vehicle customization system wasn't as fun, but the story was pretty decent when you could piece it together in the open world. It had at least a few cool characters that were memorable. Metal Max Xeno did some amazing things, like eliminate a lot of the menuing and annoying UI stuff that plagued the numbered Metal Max games, but it was really missing a lot of the fun human villains and bounties that gave the numbered games their memorable moments and personality. Even among the humans that did exist in Metal Max Xeno, it was hard to cultivate any meaningful drama or conflict among them when there were so few, and they were essentially on the same side to fight the final boss, instead of constantly trying to one-up each other like in the other Metal Max games. The open world also didn't feel nearly as open with its choke points. The post-apocalyptic set pieces were really cool, and the music was amazing for cultivating emotions in some of the game's interior locations. The final boss was pretty awesome too, but the world of Dystopia in Metal Max Xeno was a little too empty. Metal Max Xeno Reborn in particular cut some content and was kind of a step backwards for the series as a whole. I still enjoyed the game and feel like it had a lot of untapped potential, but it's not something I could recommend as easily as the numbered flagship titles unless you care more about about graphics than gameplay and story. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention a quirky spin-off game released recently on Steam called Metal Dogs that takes place in a Metal Max universe where humans have gone extinct and you get to play as a doggo in a casual shooter. It exists in English. It's admittedly a cute game that portrays the charm of dogs in Metal Max pretty well, but it's probably not going to get people excited over the series. I think Metal Max has just had a lot of unfortunate issues with licensing, different publishers, and platform availability that made it really hard for the games to really get the kind of foothold a lot of other good JRPG franchises had. To add to that, there's almost no history of the Metal Max games in the West, with most people maybe remembering Metal Saga when any discussion of Metal Max arises, and a few might bring up Metal Max Xeno. After Metal Max Wild West was cancelled, I was profoundly sad, but Cygames, the creators of Granblue Saga, recently purchased the Metal Max IP in July 2022, and they definitely have the money to fund an incredibly ambitious Metal Max game if they put even half the resources they spent developing Granblue Fantasy Relink into it. And that's why I have to mention that Metal Max Returns, Metal Max 2 Reloaded, and Metal Max 3 can be played in English with fan translations. I highly encourage anybody who may have found anything I've said in this video interesting and isn't offended by emulation to try out the games for yourself. Metal Max 4 is currently being fan translated by Metal Dreamers, who did great work on Metal Max 2 Reloaded and Metal Max 3. I'm personally looking forward to playing Metal Max 4 the most, as out of all the Metal Max games, that game seems to have the most excitement behind it. Like I was with Live Alive before Square Enix dropped that bombshell last year, I'm just waiting for Cygames to release these games in the West so I can give them my money to make more of them. And I'm hoping people see this video and maybe get encouraged to try out a game in this amazing series to fuel future sales of the games if they ever come west. Thanks for watching and have a great day.